Virgil across his tenure there. So today we wanted to have a conversation about the two films that we just watched, Peculiar Contrast, Perfect Light, and Amen Break. Again, these were the films that presented those collections, Fall Winter 21 and Spring Summer 2022. So let's get into it. First, maybe I'll kick this to both of you guys, or I'll kick one to you and then to you. Can you set the stage a little bit about why these collections were presented as films? So we know it was COVID, but can you set the stage a little bit about the conversation that led to the first of these?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the time, Virgil was searching for a new idiom within the language of the runway show, like not an alternative to the runway show, but like trying to find a form within the runway show that could hold some of the political freight, that could hold some of the things that both he and everyone in the collective were kind of feeling at the time. You know, I think like there was George Floyd, there was Ferguson, there were riots, there was a lot going on, and there was a lot of that, and he wanted to find a different form of expression. And you know, there was a lot of talk initially about certain iconic runway shows, McQueen at Givenchy. There was one Mugler show that we talked about a lot, Linda Evangelista. It lasted as long as her cigarette. She lit a cigarette and walked the perimeter of the stage while other models walked faster than her, and then she flicked it at the end and the lights went dark. And so we were just talking about these like sort of these like shows that had a certain purity of form, and because of that they were able to hold a lot of emotion and a lot of energy. And then COVID hit, and so it was convenient that we'd be able to shoot a film. I think it was going to be a live performance initially. Yeah.
And Benji, you'd worked with Virgil quite a bit before LV.
Yeah. And
then you had worked on every collection and show once you started at LV. And I know you've talked a lot about how live music had always been the emphasis for all the prior shows, and then for these you couldn't do that. So talk about your process for these ones.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're right, of course, and to add to Mahfuz's point, I think it's fair to say that Virgil was always looking to break with convention from show one. And one of the conversations I'd always witness was with him with show callers and stage planners and blockers of shows, trying to explain that, you know, fashion doesn't have to be models walking in a straight line, you know, up and down for 8 minutes. And that was constantly a sort of mission, and sometimes a bit of a battle or a negotiation with, you know, along the way. And so that wasn't a story that necessarily started in 2020, but really blossomed in 2020, almost out of necessity, because as you said, it was COVID. And what's really important to mention about the two films that we just watched is that the first one, we didn't know it was going to be a film. The second one we did, we were prepared and we went in to make a film. But the first one that you saw that featured Yassine Bey at the end and Saul Williams at the beginning was shot in Tennis Club de Paris, and that was supposed to be a regular fashion show. Like normal attendance, I think, for Vuitton fashion shows are like 800 to 1,000 people. They're quite large. And excuse me, we received a call saying, oh, we can't do 1,000, actually it's going to be 600. And then gradually it was, when 600 went to 300, went to 100 people socially distanced, went to 50 VIPs in masks, went to actually you can have no one. And one thing we have to pay real credit to the filmmakers for is that no filmmaker would really necessarily choose that venue to shoot a film in. So we sort of had to adapt to make what was going to be a live fashion show into something which wasn't even a live stream, but something that was a post-produced film. And so to your point, Chloe, about, you know, wanting to kind of change the way that we do things and what you were saying about breaking convention, it was almost a beautiful way to learn how to swim by being thrown in the Pacific. We all had to become, I mean, of course, respect to all of the filmmakers that were already filmmakers, but certainly I thought I was doing music for a runway show and ended up scoring a film. And so, yeah, you're right, the process was very different. To your point about it being live music, Chloe's referring to a sort of like a rule book that we had when I started with Virgil in 2018. We decided that all of the main fashion shows, I call them main fashion shows because we did offshoot ones in other countries, but the flagship, let's say, fashion shows that happen in Men's Fashion Week during Paris would always be live music. And so we tried to accommodate that to a certain degree into these films, and pretty much all of the music that you hear in both of them is bespoke music made for them. So it might be not being performed live in the film, but as we'll get into later in our talk, we spent many days in many studios recording all of that music ahead of time. And what you hear is live recordings from the likes of Jizza and from Saul, of course, and from Asmara, who we'll talk about as well. So most of the music that you hear in those two films was made especially for the film. So the process just kind of flipped a little bit.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make the like phrase "break with convention" a little bit more concrete. In the case of Peculiar Contrast, Perfect Light, there is a runway, but the film has a 3-act structure, right? There is a MacGuffin or a red herring. There's a bag that's carried through it, and at each point of transition, the set deconstructs, right? Like you see the set in 3 states: full walls, like partial sort of crumbled walls, and then just bricks, right, strewn about the stage. So there was an effort to try and force that semi-film, semi-live setup to hold a lot of narrative, and that was like something we pushed in 6, and then obviously 7, we knew it was going to be a film from the beginning, and so we were able to do away with the runway altogether and like build these, fully like realized separate sets and locations.
Yeah. What I love about these films, so I'm biased, but I think these films are some of the most radical, revolutionary contributions to the history of fashion ever. Honestly, I do. And there's so much in them. And I love how people come maybe for a fashion show, but as part of that they get, so with Peculiar Contrast, Perfect Light, as part of that they get this reference to James Baldwin and his story essay, Stranger in the Village. They get this deep conversation with contemporary art and contemporary performance art. Moved by the Motion was a collective that was brought on to help lead this film across film direction, movement direction, music, alongside Benji. You get this history lesson in music with Mos. You get a history lesson with Saul Williams present. So there's so many levels to
MF Doom.
There's so many levels to the film, as you mentioned. You guys also would talk a lot about how isn't every film sort of a fashion film? Fashion film is this genre of film that's not per se the most prestigious, but you guys would talk a lot about how every film sort of is a fashion film. And the goal with these was really for these to stand on their own as cinema, not just as, documentation of a fashion collection. So that was a big ramble to maybe kind of set you guys off into talking about, one, what was it like to work with Moved by the Motion, those brilliant folks? And can you unpack a little bit more just all the quote unquote levels, maybe starting with Peculiar Contrast, Perfect Light in the film?
Well, I think 2 words that we should really come back to, as well as breaking convention, that you've both mentioned, is narrative and codes. Because, we're at an exhibition called The Codes, and it's no exaggeration to say, this is not like a pretentious statement to say that pretty much every corner that you find in the building of the exhibit that you've just looked through, if you zone into any one item, there are multiple codes, multiple references, and multiple stories within that item. What's really important to note is that it doesn't matter if you don't necessarily know what those codes and those references are. That's just an invisible frequency that you feel. It's something that gives work authenticity, and I for sure know that things resonate with me, and I don't know all the reference points, or I'm not educated enough in certain areas like architecture or art or other things, but certain things resonate or jump out at me. And I think that's true of everything that you see in this exhibit that these guys have beautifully curated. But I think that's extra true, which I can go through in almost granular detail for every single element of the films that you just watched. And the codes that are in these films are so many and so multiple that we'd have to spend a day going through them, but we can touch on a few today. And that is kind of inextricably connected to the word narrative. A narrative is something that Virgil blessed us all with on every show, not just these. Because certainly when I'm collaborating with something, I can't really do much musically unless I have narrative. And narrative on these shows was to the power of 100. It was I was amazingly privileged to be part of that narrative story from the beginning. And so if anyone was at the chat that I had with Will Welch the other day, I mentioned this already, is that often, you're asked to put some cool music to a cool thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what you've just seen is really quite the opposite of that experience. It's like being in a sandbox with all the creatives, from the people writing the narrative through to the people designing the set, through to the people designing the clothes, through to pretty much everything from the ground up. And I think it's really relevant for Mahfuz to talk a little bit about the narrative of what these two films are actually about. Because what's beautiful about them is it doesn't necessarily matter if you don't immediately get it, but it's kind of like a play. Once you start to go deeper into understanding what they're actually about, they might kind of sing a bit more, and then I can talk about how the music relates a bit better to that. But narrative is key, and the codes within that narrative is key, and I think that's probably a good place for us to start digging.
Yeah, back in 2019, let's say, Virgil and I and Chloe, we talked a lot about the language of minimalism.
Yeah.
And how one of the, we believe, racist dog whistles in fashion is conversations around selection. You have to choose. Like Virgil just didn't edit well, was like a common kind of claim, as opposed to maximalism as a certain kind of methodology, as a certain kind of archival practice. Yeah. Everything has to stay in because everything is a Black story that we're trying to retain. And so we talked a lot about that formally. What it means to overcode something, to overlayer something with references. And so in the case of certainly Peculiar Contrast, Perfect Light, there's just a lot in there. There's obviously like Moved by the Motion, who are dealing with dance and the legacy of like Black choreography. Josh, Bill T. Jones, right? Like a certain lineage that Josh Johnson, the choreographer, exists in. You're dealing with a lot of movies, like the Ronin briefcase is in there, for example. You're dealing with Alan Caprow, fluids, right? An ice block that melts, right? Being converted into a Miesian, sort of like Miesian architecture. You have Mies, but skewed through Virgil. You have paper Mies skewed through Virgil. You have Chicago. You have surveillance culture in there, right? Like there are like surveillance objects throughout the space. You have ice skating, right? Which was partially a reference to Arthur Jafa, to an Arthur Jafa quote about figure skating. It goes on. And so like Virgil kind of felt like the entire mood board should stay in for these shows. Like nothing should go. Certain things that are on the board that were maybe a music reference might end up being an image that's printed on a garment, might be, right, like nothing goes. And in like Amen Break, it's even more extreme, right? Because we're trying to thread the needle between, the history of drum and bass and the history of rap and their twin origins. And so yeah, that's like partially a testament to how Virgil structured collectives. He liked very large collectives. He liked redundancy. Redundancy was important to him. He didn't believe in redundancy. Like there could be 3 stylists on a project. There could be 4 directors on a project. And that partially comes out of, his background in music, I think.
Definitely.
But that redundancy meant that everyone got represented, Kai was in town, I guess they're spitting a poem. I guess the poem is going in. You know what I mean? And so anyways, I'm starting to ramble, forgive me. But I think like there is a politics to that kind of density. And it was important to him, especially at that time, because I think there is a certain complicated racism to how Black production is talked about, right? And so anyways, I digress.
I definitely that analogy of like the music producer really resonates, you know, because when you work in very like big record projects with, especially in the pop world or in the big kind of artist world, it's very common to have like loads of different producers pull up and add to the beat, or loads of different songwriters come and write a top line, or loads of different people try and just add a hi-hat or whatever. And really it's just a sea of different patches, but there's always the Quincy Jones in the middle that's choosing which patches stay and can see the big picture of what the whole patchwork looks like. And so you're absolutely right that to be in a situation where there's no such thing as a bad idea, why not have 3 directors? Why not have 3 producers on the same beat? Why not have the best minds in the same room? But it always needs the producer. And that's the Virgil production eye of being the Tao in the center of the seesaw of all of these extreme kind of points of view was one of the areas of mastery, in my opinion, from my point of view, which I have the benefit of retrospective looking at now, and I've worked with a lot of amazing creative people that tend to balance one way or the other, but he was somehow the sort of the sun with all these planets orbiting that had various different gravitational pulls and opinions and everything, and he would somehow manage to distill all of those into this real central thought. And as you said, it was a maximum thought where all of those planets had a voice and they all could exist in harmony together. And in other spaces, we know that they can't. But Virgil enabled them to somehow find this harmony in these films. And I could go on, but you interject, otherwise me and him will be like, we need the wrap it up box.
What was the relationship between the clothes and the filmmaking process, especially in the second film, where I recall the Vuitton men's studio, so many talented designers, of course overseen by V. They would work on the collection, send everyone working on the film back ideas, and then everyone working on the film would send back like storyboards and character studies of characters in the film. And there'd sort of be that conversation back and forth between the folks in charge of design of the collection and then the collective working on the film. Meanwhile, Virgil's overseeing all of it with his hands in all of it to such detail. What was the relationship between the clothing and the filmmaking and the music?
That's a great question. Elliot from Virgil Studios actually here. I think an important change. An important change was Virgil and Ibrahim Kamara started working together. That was probably, was that 4? 5. 5 was the first one.
It started with the one in Tokyo, actually.
Exactly. So like 5.2, or it was like a traveling. Yeah, exactly. Virgil and Ibrahim started exploring their own personal histories with African. I would say, like in the case of Ibrahim, it was sub-Saharan, and then in the case of Virgil, it was Ghana. They started exploring formal attire, formal wear, traditional, and looking at the way that people in their everyday lives, black men, women in their everyday lives, code switch between different styles of dress. First, it was on a very simple level, literally like your traditional garments, and then what you wear more socially when you're not going to traditional events. Then they started flipping traditional religious events with formal attire, suiting. Then code switching became a device, and then they started playing with code switching as a racial device, right? Like, and once that started, everything started playing. Like buttons, details on garments, sneakers would get mixed with suits, elements of suits would get mixed with kente cloth would get mixed, and so there was that play already with with sort of like a certain density of African and African American references. And that just carried through the show, and a lot of it is like deeply coded. I mean, I think before we watched this, I mean, I was like laughing with Elliot because Virgil was at a gas station in Chicago on the South Side. He went to visit. It's probably okay. I'm just gonna tell the story. He went to visit the Astor Gates, and on the way back, he had to refill his car. He stopped at a gas station in the Hood, and in Chicago, if you know Chicago, you know that it's just a stylistic quirk. The undercover cops wear hockey jerseys and larger jerseys to cover their bulletproof vests, and so it's a common kind of bulky. You'll like see them, and there were a couple of them in the gas station, and that became a device for the nemesis in Amen Break. He started exploring hockey padding. He started looking at over padding, oversized tops. And so that's an example of this kind of weird, like undercover cops in the Hood on the South Side of Chicago, suddenly becoming Louis Vuitton apparel. And so anyways, I can like ramble about this for a long time, but I like hope that answers your question. Like everything followed from the collections and from what was happening in the studio, and from a lot of what we were doing was reacting to a lot of what they were doing and interpreting it or misinterpreting it or productively misunderstanding it. And so a lot of the mood boards would get delivered into the studio and added in to the wall for whatever was going on. We would also see across the chats, we would see those early periods where they're doing collection research and early sketches, and we would see all of it. So all of it was going back and forth and migrating back and forth. Like with Amen Break, I feel like in the beginning, the first explorations were white tees, references to white tees. We started seeing PDFs of that, like the white t-shirt, which obviously is a great example of a potential code switch that's formal, right? Just with sizing, just with cut, how you can move back and forth between black street style and, James Dean or Paul Newman.
And it's also